Hello, my friend. Welcome to Dreamy Nights. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, we'll drift together into a place of quiet wonder, a sanctuary where the air smells of old parchment and candlelight dances upon shelves of memory. So settle in, take a slow breath, and let the day dissolve into stillness. When you're ready, our story begins. The night had folded itself gently over the world, leaving only the pale shimmer of moonlight to wander across the hills. Far from any village or road, hidden beyond a grove of silver-leaf trees, stood the Whisperwind Library, a sanctuary of knowledge that seemed less built than dreamed into existence. Its tall windows glowed faintly like lanterns remembering their purpose. Inside, silence lived like a friend. The air was tender with the scent of cedarwood dust and ink, a perfume that spoke of patience and time's slow devotion. The long hallways were lined with bookshelves so tall they vanished into shadow, and the floor, smooth stone veined with quartz, caught the soft reflection of candle flames. Every sound seemed rounded, softened the quiet thud of a closing book, the sigh of fabric as someone moved between the aisles. That someone was Elara. She moved with unhurried grace, her robe trailing softly behind her, carrying traces of lavender from the drying racks in the northern alcove. In her hands, she held a small oil lamp, its light no brighter than the thought of morning. She paused often, listening not for footsteps or voices, but for the whispers. The library was alive with them. They came from the pages and bindings from the ancient stones that had absorbed centuries of reading, murmuring, and rest. If one listened long enough, the hush began to hum with story, a language made of memory rather than words. Elara tilted her head, eyes half closed, and smiled. "Another has awoken," she whispered. Her steps led her to a secluded corner where an oak table sat beneath an arched window. Moonlight gathered there like a pool of glass. Upon the table rested an artifact, a bronze compass, tarnished and half open, its needle trembling, as though stirred by breath alone. Elara brushed away a thin layer of dust, and the air around her shifted like the first note of a long-forgotten melody. This was her nightly ritual to uncover the small histories tucked between time's folds. She did not read the books for their words, but for their essence. The weight of each page, the faint stains of ink, the texture of paper, these told her stories that no script could hold. She opened her journal, its pages thick and soft as pressed petals. With deliberate calm, she dipped her quill into ink the color of twilight, and began to write. Tonight, the compass of the lost voyager stirred once more. It hums with a yearning that feels like home remembered. Perhaps it once pointed not to north, but to belonging. The quill's whisper joined the rhythm of the candles flickering. The air glowed warmer, tender around her face. Elara smiled faintly and leaned back, letting her eyes wander across the shelves, rows upon rows of forgotten voices, all resting, waiting, dreaming. She thought of how the library itself seemed to breathe, the walls inhaling silence, the lamps exhaling calm. Each breath brought forth fragments of the past, the rustle of parchment from centuries ago, a ghost of laughter from a scholar long since returned to dust. The Whisperwind Library did not collect stories. It remembered them. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy clinging to the windows, and the faint sound mingled with the low hum of night insects. Within, the temperature held steady, a comforting coolness, balanced by the warmth of light. Every sense was quieted yet awake. Elara rose again and walked between the shelves, trailing her fingers along the spines of the books. Some were bound in leather, some in silk, some in materials no one could quite name. She could tell their age not by their covers, but by the tone of their silence. The newer ones still shimmered faintly with memory. The oldest radiated a steady, endless calm. At the heart of the library stood a tall hourglass. Its sand fell soundlessly, grain by grain, catching the glow of the lamps like scattered stars. Elara often paused here, simply watching. There was no need to mark time, for in the Whisperwind Library, time was a guest, not a master. She placed her lamp beside the hourglass and whispered a small vow, one she repeated each evening, to listen and to remember, to honor the voices that once were. Then she blew gently upon the compass. The needle stilled, resting at last. A soft pulse of peace settled into the air. The night deepened, carrying with it the quiet hum of understanding that even forgotten things yearned to be felt again. Elara closed her eyes. In the distance, the faintest chime echoed the sound of the library's breath, synchronizing with her own. She smiled, her hand resting upon the journal, and let the world soften around her. The Whisperwind Library sighed contentedly, and silence, kind and endless, filled the halls once more. The hours drifted gently, as though time itself had settled into a slow and steady breathing. The Whisperwind Library was quiet again, a vast and patient stillness that wrapped around Elara like a soft shawl. Beyond the tall windows, The moon had climbed higher, casting pale ribbons of light across the marble floors. Each shimmer seemed to move with thought, sliding slowly over the scattered books and relics waiting for her touch. Elara stood before the Hall of Forgotten Relics, a chamber few ever entered. The great doors carved from silver ashwood opened with a sound like a sigh. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with beeswax and sandalwood. The glow of a dozen lamps revealed objects arranged with reverent care, relics rescued from lost eras, their stories muted by dust, but never entirely silent. She walked between the display tables, her lamp trembling with each breath of wind from the corridor. There were hourglasses with stopped sand crystal lenses, clouded by age scrolls sealed with threads of gold. But tonight, her gaze rested on a single small chest, unassuming, its hinges darkened by time. As she lifted the lid, the hinges gave a soft creak, and a thin layer of air escaped, cool and old as memory. Inside lay a piece of woven silver cloth, folded neatly, its threads faintly glimmering under the lamplight. Elara's fingertips brushed its edge. It felt impossibly smooth, like water caught in stillness. She closed her eyes and listened. A whisper rose, delicate as breath over glass. At first, it was only a murmur, but soon the fragments became words, faint impressions that carried no sound, yet stirred her thoughts. Images formed a quiet workshop filled with looms, the rhythmic click of wooden spindles, the scent of smoke and rose oil. She saw hands weaving by candlelight, the threads glowing faintly with each movement. In her journal, Elara wrote slowly, the ink gliding like mist, the cloth of moon thread woven by those who listened to the night. It carries silence the way rivers carry reflections, never still yet, never breaking. She paused, feeling the soft hum within the words. The library's lamps flickered in agreement shadows, shifting like nodding heads. Beyond the doorway, the wind pressed against the glass panes, humming in quiet harmony. It was said that the Whisperwind Library had been built not by architects, but by rememberers, people who shaped walls and shelves around the essence of what the world longed to recall. Every stone, every shelf, every lamp seemed to hold that intent. Elara often wondered how many lives had touched these relics before they reached this sanctuary. She did not see them as possessions, but as echoes, tender remnants of hearts that once sought meaning in their creation. Moving to a nearby table, she found a small music box, its wood faded to a silvery gray. A note beside it read, "For the child who dreamed in lullabies." Elara turned the key with care. The first notes rose hesitantly, thin and trembling, before finding their melody, a tune so simple and kind that even the shadows seemed to soften. The sound filled the hall, mingling with the faint tick of the hourglass in the distance. As the melody played, she imagined the child perhaps sitting near a window long ago, the night air cool, listening as the tune lulled them towards sleep. She smiled at the thought that somewhere beyond time's veil, the same music might be echoing still. Elara wrote again. Some stories never wish to be told. They only wish to be remembered. Their silence hums like the space between notes where peace dwells. She set down her quill and stretched her fingers, feeling the warmth of the lamplight on her skin. The rhythmic drip of wax from a nearby candle marked the night's passage. Yet even as the hours deepened, the library felt untouched by time, as though dawn itself waited outside, patient and unhurried. Elara closed the lid of the music box. The tune lingered in the air like perfume fading into stillness. She took the silver cloth and folded it once more, her movements slow and deliberate. A faint luminescence remained upon her fingertips, shimmering before dissolving into the cool air. Walking back through the hall, she passed a mirror framed in oak. The reflection caught her in its glass, soft light. Calm face eyes, steady. For an instant, she thought she saw another reflection beside hers, the faint outline of someone weaving beneath starlight. Then it was gone. The Whisperwind Library settled deeper into silence. The lamps dimmed slightly, their glow turning amber and gold. Somewhere in the rafters, a dove shifted in its sleep feathers, rustling softly. Elara placed her hand upon the nearest shelf and whispered a blessing, one she had learned from the elder librarians. May the quiet guard what the world has forgotten. May remembrance rest easy beneath these beams. Then she turned toward the reading alcove, where a kettle sat waiting on a brass stand. She poured herself a cup of chamomile tea, the steam curling like a soft spirit through the air. She lifted it slowly, breathing in its warmth. The night was far from over, yet it held no urgency. Only the steady rhythm of discovery, the companionship of stillness. And in that calm, the library listened back. Dawn was still distant, though the edges of night had softened into a quiet silver. The Whisperwind Library slumbered in its timeless rhythm, a place where even stillness had a pulse. The candles burned low, their flames bending with the faint sighs of the air. Elara sat near the great reading table, the lamplight painting slow amber circles around her. Before her rested an open book, its pages thick and ivory-colored, covered in writing so faint it seemed to vanish if one looked too quickly. She leaned closer. The ink shimmered faintly like dew catching moonlight. The letters were not quite letters, but threads of shadow and gleam woven across the page. It was one of the listening volume's manuscripts set to record only the sounds of their readers' hearts. When opened, they spoke not in words, but in feeling. Elara placed her hand upon the page. A warmth spread beneath her palm, not from heat, but recognition. She closed her eyes. A slow image formed, a small village, perhaps centuries ago, built beside a still river. The sound of gentle laughter, the smell of wet clay and wood smoke. She could feel the rhythm of those lives, their quiet dedication to simple things, tending fires, mending nets, lighting lamps at dusk. When she opened her eyes, she smiled softly. "You remember well," she whispered to the book. She wrote in her journal, "The listening volumes do not tell what was said. They recall what was felt, the warmth of company, the ease of silence shared. Their stories are not meant to be read, but rested in." The whisper of her quill blended with the rustling of distant curtains. A current of air moved gently through the library, brushing against her cheek. Somewhere, the old hourglass turned of its own accord, beginning another cycle. Elara rose, stretching her arms, her robe rustling softly like distant rain. She wandered toward the mezzanine, a curved balcony overlooking the endless rows of shelves below. The scent of cedar, old parchment, and faint tea leaves drifted upward, wrapping the air in comfort. From above, the Whisperwind Library looked like a breathing organism, its aisles like veins, its lamps like quiet stars. She loved this view most of all. It reminded her that even stillness could have movement, that even silence could sing. As she leaned upon the rail, something glimmered faintly on the far side of the hall. A pale blue light, no larger than a pearl. She followed it down the stairway, the lamp in her hand guiding her path. At the end of the corridor stood a tall cabinet carved from dark birch. The glow came from within through a half-open door. Elara eased it wider, and inside she found an hourglass unlike the rest. Its sand was pale as frost, its frame made of glass vines twisted into spirals, and within it the sand flowed upward. For a long time she simply watched, mesmerized by the quiet impossibility of it. Each grain rose slowly, unhurriedly, returning to the top, as though remembering where it came from. She felt no confusion, only calm wonder. The library, after all, had never obeyed the ordinary. She lifted the hourglass carefully. its glow casting faint reflections on her robe. A cool vibration passed through her fingertips. Not a sound, but a feeling. Something between thought and memory. In her mind, a scene unfolded, a scholar seated at a desk by candlelight, weeping softly as they turned the glass, whispering words of farewell. The hourglass had been crafted to hold their parting, not sorrow, but gratitude, so that time would forever return to the moment before loss. Elara's eyes grew misty, though her heart felt light. She whispered, "The hours that heal return quietly, not to erase, but to rest beside us." The glow dimmed as though the relic had heard her and grown peaceful again. She placed it gently back upon its stand. The floor beneath her feet held the warmth of her steps. The air carried the faintest trace of frankincense from the nearby lamps. Everything was as it should be, the world breathing, the silence living. She made her way to the alcove where the library kept its inkwells. There were hundreds of them, each carved from stone, crystal, or seashell. Some held ink of deep blue, others of muted gold. The one she reached for tonight shimmered faintly, a mixture of silver and violet used for writing on the most delicate of papers. She poured a drop into her inkwell, stirring it with a quill. It caught the lamplight and shimmered like liquid dusk. Then, upon a new page, she wrote, "The hours are not lost. They simply walk beside us until we notice them again." The words seemed to settle into the page like seeds finding earth. She blew gently to dry the ink, and for a moment, the letters glowed softly before fading into stillness. Elara leaned back and listened to the hush of the library, to the hum of her own heartbeat, to the faint rustle of parchment stirred by the night air. Every sound folded into the next, creating a quiet symphony of belonging. Somewhere beyond the tall glass windows, the horizon began to shimmer faintly. Not dawn yet, but its first invisible thought. Elara smiled. Another relic had spoken another story, remembered. The Whisperwind Library had many more to share, and she, its patient listener, would remain until the last candle sighed into darkness. The hourglass turned itself once more. The sand rose slowly upward, glowing as it did. The night deepened once more, yet within the Whisperwind Library, time felt as fluid as ink swirling in water. The lamps burned lower now, their flames steady and thin, casting halos of soft gold that trembled against the vaulted ceiling. The hush that lingered was not emptiness, but fullness, the kind of silence that holds meaning in every breath. Elara sat at her favorite table beneath the east window, where moonlight pooled gently over stacks of parchment and open tomes. Beside her, a cup of tea cooled slowly, its steam spiraling upward like a small spirit returning home. The library had grown quieter than usual. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, listening. She turned her gaze toward the cabinet of cartographies, a towering shelf filled with ancient maps, some drawn on silk, others etched upon thin sheets of glass. These were no ordinary charts. The library kept maps of memories, not places. Landscapes of feeling, constellations of thought, pathways of dream. Elara lifted one such piece from the cabinet, unrolling it with care. It was drawn in soft inks of silver and indigo. The lines did not mark roads or borders, but movements. The quiet paths of starlight reflected upon rivers, the gentle drift of falling leaves, the unseen pattern of rest in the turning of the seasons. As she traced one of the glowing lines with her fingertip, the ink shimmered faintly, and the air around her changed. A cool fragrance rose, a blend of pine and faint rain, and she found herself feeling the map rather than seeing it. A memory surfaced, a forest at dusk, branches heavy with dew, the hush of moss beneath bare feet, the sound of water somewhere unseen, whispering like a secret that did not need to be kept. She breathed deeply and smiled. A map of stillness, she murmured, drawn by someone who understood how silence moves. Elara opened her journal once more. The soft rasp of the paper, a comfort. Each path of memory is written in more than ink. It is the tracing of what once was felt and what still remains between moments. Some maps lead not outward but inward to the quiet at the heart of things. She closed the map, rolling it gently, the parchment, exhaling a sigh as if relieved to rest again. In the next alcove, a faint shimmer caught her attention, a low shelf filled with glass globes of whisper light. Each globe contained a faint swirl of color, and within that color, the essence of a voice once spoken. Some glowed amber like dawn, others deep blue as twilight. Elara lifted one globe and held it close. It was cool at first, then slowly warmed against her skin. The faintest murmur rose from within, a tone without words, a vibration that brushed the edge of memory. She felt it hum softly against her pulse. Setting it upon the table, she watched as the light brightened, revealing faint traces of script across its surface, names, dates, symbols. They flickered briefly, then faded. Whisper of a farewell. Elara breathed, the kind that lingers longer than the voice that spoke it. She wrote again in her journal, "Even the softest goodbyes carry warmth." They drift through the air and settle where patience lives. The library gathers them not to remember sorrow, but to cradle gentleness. The room glowed faintly with reflected candlelight. Her handwriting gleamed for a moment before blending into shadow. Then came the faint chime of the central clock, a note so low it felt rather than heard. Its resonance spread through the library like ripples across still water. The sound reached even the upper shelves where the oldest books rested like sleeping elders. Elara closed her eyes, listening. With each chime, a fragment of light seemed to pulse along the walls, awakening the faint gold of the carvings. The sound was not a marking of hours, but a blessing, a reminder that time too could be gentle. She rose and walked toward the hall of breathlight, a narrow corridor lined with translucent panels that captured the glow of every candle in the building. As she passed, her reflection multiplied 100 softened echoes of herself walking in unison. It felt like moving within a dream of mirrors. Halfway through, she paused and touched one of the panels. Beneath her palm, warmth bloomed faint but alive. The surface held an imprint of all who had walked this path before her, their calm presence layered upon the glass, like invisible fingerprints of peace. She whispered quietly, "We are all keepers of one another's stillness." The reflection smiled back. When Elara returned to her table, her tea had cooled completely. She did not mind. She lifted the cup and drank anyway. The flavor was delicate, like herbs remembering rain. The sensation grounded her, anchoring her gently between the dreamlike quiet of the library and the tender weight of the present. Outside, the wind began again, weaving through the ivy that cloaked the stone walls. Its rhythm matched the slow pulse of her heartbeat, steady, unhurried, eternal. She turned down the wick of her lamp until the flame was barely visible, leaving only a faint halo of light. Around her, the shadows deepened, tender rather than dark. The Whisperwind Library sighed softly, as though settling deeper into its own memories. Elara placed her quill beside her journal and folded her hands upon the table. She sat for a long time, simply breathing, listening to the quiet. The night had become a companion now, not something to pass through, but something to share. The lamps had burned low, and their glow had turned the color of warm honey. Shadows swayed gently upon the marble floors, slow and drowsy, as though the very air had grown heavy with peace. The Whisperwind Library seemed to breathe in its sleep, each flicker of light a soft inhale, each whisper of parchment an exhale. Elara sat beneath the dome of the observatory wing, where glass panels arched high above her like a crystal canopy. Beyond them, The sky was an ocean of darkness, scattered with drifting stars. The faint sound of the wind brushing the glass ceiling filled the silence with its tender rhythm. The world outside was softly humming to itself. She had come here often when the hour grew late, not to read, but to listen to the echoes between the stars. It was said that the library's founders had built this chamber to remind those who studied here that knowledge and wonder were the same thing, only spoken in different languages. On the table before her rested a single artifact, a small astrolabe made of bronze and lapis. Its delicate rings were etched with markings in a language no longer known, yet its design seemed perfectly familiar to her hands. When she tilted it toward the lamplight, the tiny inlaid stones caught the glow and sent it shimmering across the walls in quiet arcs of blue and gold. She ran her thumb gently over the surface, feeling the coolness of the metal. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint hum, a vibration deep and distant, like the echo of a note struck centuries ago. Then the hum shaped itself into something subtler, more intimate, a whispering rhythm, almost like a breath. She listened. Images unfurled in her mind, an ancient scholar beneath a midnight sky tracing the constellations with careful fingers. The smell of warm wax from a candle, the faint scratch of ink as they recorded what the stars revealed. The hum deepened, then faded again, leaving behind the same quiet peace that filled the library's endless halls. Elara smiled softly. "You remember the night," she said, as if to the astrolabe itself, and the patience it took to listen. She opened her journal and wrote, "Every artifact in this place remembers the shape of a hand. Every mark upon its surface is a kind of devotion. The stars above, the ink below both, are stories written in light." The words shimmered faintly in the glow before settling into the paper. When she looked up, she noticed something faint yet familiar. On the curved glass above, a pattern of condensation had formed tiny droplets, clustering in soft constellations. The image mirrored the design of the astrolabe perfectly. Elara traced one droplet with her gaze and exhaled slowly, a sound that seemed to join the wind itself. The universe, she thought, was always listening back. She leaned against the back of her chair, eyes half closed, and let her mind drift toward the soft hum of the library. It sounded now like a gentle chorus, faint vibrations from countless relics, tomes and memories, all breathing together. Some tones high, others low, merging into a music that no composer could write down. From the shadows, the clock gave a single tone, deep and resonant. The note rippled through the stillness, and the candles wavered in response, their flames bowing lightly. Elara rose and crossed the observatory floor. The sound of her steps echoed gently, mingling with the distant sigh of the air through the tall windows. She approached one of the glass panes and rested her palm against it. The surface was cool and smooth, yet alive with faint vibration, the pulse of the night itself. Outside, a veil of mist had begun to drift across the gardens. The moonlight pressed through it softly, painting the grounds in silver haze. The ivy on the stone walls shimmered faintly, each leaf holding its own tiny pool of reflected light. Elara's reflection gazed back at her, softened by the glass and the mist. She hardly recognized it anymore, not because it had changed, but because the stillness had reshaped her. The days beyond the library, with all their noise and rush, felt like distant echoes of another life. Here, every motion belonged to the slow rhythm of breathing and memory. She turned from the window and walked to the central dais, where a circular mosaic lay embedded in the floor, a map of stars rendered in white marble and onyx. The lamplight brought it to life, orbits of gentle radiance circling a single glowing stone at its heart. Elara knelt and placed her hand upon that center stone. To remember, she whispered, is to listen with the soul. The glow brightened, then slowly dimmed again, as though the library itself nodded in quiet agreement. For a while she remained like that, still composed, her breathing synchronized with the faint shimmer of the light. Around her, the relics and tomes rested peacefully, their stories murmuring in languages made only of warmth and quiet. At last, she rose and returned to her writing desk. She poured herself another cup of tea, now faintly scented with chamomile and dried apple. The first sip carried a soft sweetness like sunlight remembered through glass. In the silence, she thought of how the library had no clocks to measure its nights. There was no end, no beginning, only moments, opening into moments like pages turned by invisible hands. She wrote one final line before extinguishing her lamp. The stars above and the stories below are the same fragments of wonder waiting to be felt. Then, closing her journal, she leaned back and let the stillness cradle her. The glow of the hourglass pulsed faintly in the distance, its upward falling sand gleaming with quiet purpose. The Whisperwind Library, eternal and serene, held its breath once more. The night lingered in a hush so deep it seemed to suspend even thought. The Whisperwind Library rested within its own dream, every lamp a heartbeat of gold, every book a gentle sigh in the half-dark. Outside, mist wound through the gardens like a silver ribbon, brushing the ivy walls with dew. Inside, Elara moved softly between shelves, her footsteps scarcely disturbing the quiet air. She carried a lantern of frosted glass, its light tender and diffused, spilling like moon water along the corridor. The library was vast, yet every turn felt familiar, a sanctuary she had long since come to know not by sight, but by rhythm. Tonight her path led to the vault of murmured ink, a secluded chamber deep beneath the east stairwell. Few ever entered it. The doors were carved from pale stone, their surfaces etched with curling vines and symbols that shimmered faintly when her lantern drew near. She pressed her hand against them, and the stone gave way with a soft hum, revealing a stair that spiraled down into golden light. The vault was warmer than the rest of the library, its air scented faintly with myrrh and old cedar. The walls glowed with embedded crystals, casting a honey-colored radiance that made every shadow feel alive but gentle. Rows of low tables filled the room, each holding an open book, their pages blank their covers, breathing faintly like living things. Elara placed her lantern upon the nearest table. "Good evening," she whispered. "It's been some time." The vault responded with a rustle, the faint dry sound of parchment moving without touch. She smiled, recognizing it as a greeting. The books of murmured ink were special. They recorded not what was written, but what was felt near them. The emotions of those who lingered here were absorbed into their pages, later surfacing as faint shapes of light. Elara took a seat, resting her hands lightly upon one of the volumes. For a long moment, she said nothing, only breathed. Slowly, soft strokes of light began to form across the blank page, tender swirls of amber drifting like smoke. The library, listening as always, was painting her calm upon the page. She whispered, "Stillness has its own language. It does not demand to be understood, only shared." The lights shimmered briefly, then faded, leaving the page faintly warm beneath her fingertips. From a nearby alcove, a low tone sounded, a single note struck upon one of the crystal walls. The sound lingered, vibrating gently through the air. Elara rose and followed it, her lantern's glow spilling across the floor. At the far end of the chamber stood a pedestal, and upon it a quill unlike any other. Its feather shimmered silver blue, as though woven from light itself. The inkpot beside it held no visible liquid, only a faint swirling mist. Elara had heard of this relic, the quill of echoes, said to write not with ink, but with memory. When it touched paper, it inscribed the impressions of voices long past. She reached out carefully, her fingers hovering just above it. The air shifted. A faint whisper rose not of language, but of presence. Then slowly, the quill lifted itself, hovering above the parchment on the pedestal. Its tip began to move, tracing words that glowed like soft embers. Elara stepped closer to read. The handwriting was elegant, fluid, ancient. Every silence once had a sound. Every memory was once a breath. We are the listeners who guard what time forgets. Her eyes softened. She watched as the light of the words dimmed, sinking into the page, until only the faintest glow remained. She touched the parchment gently. The warmth it carried felt like a hand resting briefly over hers, steady, reassuring. "Thank you," she whispered. For a moment, everything was utterly still. Even the soft hum of the crystals seemed to fade, leaving only the rhythm of Elara's breathing. She realized then that this vault, hidden so deep below the world, was not meant to preserve the written word alone. It preserved the presence of listening itself. She turned back to her lantern, its glow now dimming, signaling the approach of another hour. The night above must have deepened further. The quiet had thickened into something almost tangible. As she ascended the stair, the golden light faded behind her, replaced once more by the silvery calm of the library's main hall. Upstairs, the air was cooler, the scent of night jasmine drifting faintly through open windows. A few candles had gone out, their smoke curling lazily toward the high arches. Elara relit one, shielding the flame with her hand, and for a moment, her face was haloed in amber. On her desk lay her journal, still open to the last page. She took up her quill, dipped it into the twilight ink, and wrote, "Some silences do not ask for words, only presence. The relics remember not because they wish to be known, but because they wish to rest near a heart that listens." Her handwriting was slower now, her lines looping gracefully, as though written half in thought, half in dream. Outside, the mist began to clear, revealing faint outlines of the garden statues bathed in moonlight. The world, it seemed, was awakening to its own softness again. Elara closed the journal and set it aside. Her lantern flickered once, twice, then steadied. She leaned back in her chair, her breathing long and even, her thoughts floating somewhere between the light and the quiet. Far above, the first pale hint of dawn trembled at the horizon, unseen, yet certain. And in that space between night's last sigh and morning's first breath, the Whisperwind Library waited aglow with the peace of things remembered. The whisper of dawn lingered just beyond the horizon, a thought, not yet a light. Within the Whisperwind Library, the stillness deepened rather than lifted. The air carried that particular quiet of hours too late for night and too early for morning, when even time itself seems uncertain whether to move forward or stay perfectly still. Elara stood once more in the central hall, her lamp casting soft halos across the floor. The familiar scent of cedar and faint ash filled the air, mingled now with the first traces of morning mist drifting through a half-open window. Every sound was soft-edged. The creak of wood, the distant sigh of ivy brushing the outer walls, the rustle of fabric as she moved. She crossed toward the archive of whispers, a narrow wing filled with shelves of glass cylinders. Each one held a fragment of sound voices, breaths, laughter, and songs that had once drifted through the world before being forgotten. The air here shimmered faintly alive with vibration, so delicate it could only be felt, not heard. As she entered the room, greeted her with a subtle hum like wind through the strings of a harp. Dust motes floated in the beams of light, turning slowly, patiently. Elara brushed her fingers across the tops of several cylinders. Beneath her touch, faint tones emerged, the sound of waves, the low murmur of conversation, the echo of a bell from some long-lost village square. She smiled. "You've kept them well," she whispered. One cylinder near the center glowed faintly, a soft blue light that pulsed like breath. She lifted it carefully, holding it to her ear. The sound that rose was gentle, fragmented, a lullaby sung in a language she did not know. The notes trembled with affection, unhurried and pure, as though they had been waiting centuries to be heard again. She closed her eyes, letting the melody surround her. The air seemed to shimmer, and for a moment, she could almost see it, a small room somewhere in time, a woman humming as she wove fabric beside a sleeping child. The hum carried patience, the promise of peace. When the song faded, Elara set the cylinder back upon the shelf, her gaze lingering on it. Even forgotten voices, she said softly, find their way home. She wrote in her journal, her handwriting flowing gently as the quill glided over the page. Every sound returns eventually, not to be remembered, but to rest. The world keeps its echoes as tenderly as a heart keeps its breath. She let the ink dry, then closed the journal and turned toward the western corridor where the atrium of still water awaited. The atrium was open to the night air, though sheltered by columns and vines. A circular pool rested at its center, the surface so smooth it reflected the stars with perfect clarity. Elara approached quietly, her reflection merging with the constellations. The water carried the faint scent of lilies, cool and sweet. Tiny droplets clung to the edges of the marble rim, trembling like silver beads. She knelt beside the pool and dipped her fingertips into it. The water was cool, startlingly so, yet it felt alive, almost aware. At her touch, faint ripples spread outward, distorting the reflections. The stars wavered and then settled again. It was said that this pool gathered the library's dreams, reflections of everything remembered, softened and stilled. Elara watched the water calm, and in it, she thought she saw fleeting images, the silver cloth she had found earlier, the upward flowing hourglass, the quill that wrote in light. Each shimmered, then dissolved into mist. The library dreams, she murmured, and we dream with it. A small breeze drifted through the atrium, stirring the vines. Somewhere beyond the arches, a bird called once, then fell silent. The sound was soft but clear, the first hint of dawn's presence. Elara sat by the pool, her lamp beside her, its reflection trembling in the water. She breathed slowly, allowing her thoughts to dissolve. There was no hurry. The night still had one more breath to give before morning claimed it. From the far corner of the atrium came a faint glimmer, a pendulum of glass suspended from the ceiling, swaying so gently it seemed almost still. Its movement caught her eye. She rose and approached it. The pendulum was shaped like a teardrop, filled with translucent sand that shifted with the rhythm of its swing. Each motion created a odd chiming sound, a crystalline murmur that blended perfectly with the night air. She stood beneath it, letting its slow rhythm calm her pulse. It reminded her of the hourglass from before, how its sand had flowed upward. Here too, time seemed to move differently, not measured by loss or progress, but by the steady cadence of stillness itself. Elara whispered, "The measure of peace is not in moments kept, but in the quiet between their passing." The pendulum's chime answered softly, as though in agreement. As she turned back toward the pool, she saw that dawn had begun to bloom faintly in the reflection, a pale ribbon of rose and pearl stretching along the horizon. The light touched the edges of the library's stone walls, warming them by degrees. The Whisperwind Library, bathed in that first gentle glow, seemed to stretch as though waking from a long and lovely dream. Elara gathered her things, her journal, her lamp, her cup. She took one last look at the water, where her reflection mingled with the early light. Then she whispered a final line almost to herself. When silence learns to glow, it becomes memory. The breeze stirred again, carrying her words across the atrium. The lilies nodded, and the pool rippled once before returning to perfect stillness. Elara smiled faintly, then turned toward the long corridor that led back into the heart of the library. Behind her, the first light of morning began to unfurl across the sky, while within the Whisperwind Library the eternal hush remained calm, golden, infinite. The horizon softened into gold. Morning at last had come, not suddenly, but as a slow unfolding like silk, unspooling in gentle light. The Whisperwind Library welcomed it in silence, the great windows awash in a pale shimmer that seemed to move through every corridor. Candles guttered softly, surrendering their glow to the sun's calm ascent. Elara stood near the threshold of the main rotunda, the heart of the library. The dawn light pooled around her feet, turning the marble floors into rivers of pearl. Above, the stained glass ceiling stirred with color, muted rose, pale amber, deep sapphire, each hue trembling as though alive. The night stillness had not vanished. It had merely changed form, becoming a quiet that breathed with warmth. She carried her journal close, its pages filled now with the whispers of the night, a tapestry of fragments, the compass, the cloth of moon thread, the upward hourglass, the quill of echoes. Each artifact had spoken not in urgency, but in remembrance. At the center of the rotunda stood the circle of light, a round table made from luminous stone. It was here that the librarians of old had once gathered at dawn to record their reflections, believing that morning light could seal memory more gently than ink. Elara placed her journal upon the table and opened it to the last blank page. For a moment, she simply stood, letting the sun warm her face. Then, with a steady breath, she dipped her quill into the pale silver ink. The light caught the curve of her wrist as she wrote. The night has ended, but its silence remains. Within it lives every story, every breath, every touch of time's kindness. The Whisperwind Library remembers, and through remembrance it rests. She paused, the tip of her quill hovering above the page, a bead of light trembling there. Then gently she set it down. The ink shimmered once and faded into the parchment as though absorbed by the dawn itself. From somewhere high above, a dove stirred and cooed softly, the same dove that had slept among the rafters through the long night. Its sound drifted through the hall like the punctuation to a prayer. Elara smiled. "Good morning," she whispered. Her steps carried her to the tall windows that overlooked the gardens. Outside, the mist was lifting, revealing the ivy walls and the slow gleam of dew upon the stone paths. The air held a faint sweetness, the scent of earth warmed by first light. A breeze entered through the open pane, brushing her robe, setting its hem to sway gently. She thought of how many dawns the library must have seen, how many nights had passed their dreams folded carefully between the pages of time. Each artifact, each whisper, each candle's breath had been part of a single, long conversation between silence and remembrance. And now, as the first full light filled the chamber, it felt as if that conversation had reached a resting note. Elara returned to her desk. The astrolabe lay where she had left it, the compass beside it, both gleaming faintly in the new sun. The reflection of the stained glass above danced across their surfaces, turning them into moving constellations. She ran her fingers across them with care, a gesture of gratitude, not farewell. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the stories and for the silence between them." The air around her shimmered faintly briefly, as though the library itself acknowledged her words. She poured the last of her tea, now cool, into a small porcelain bowl and set it upon the sill, an offering for the day. Outside, the dove fluttered down to the ledge and drank unhurried. Elara sat for a while longer, her hands folded loosely in her lap, watching light shift across the floor. Each beam revealed new colors in the marble, pale lavender, quiet gold, silver gray. It felt as though dawn itself was writing upon the library, inscribing the world in tenderness. She thought then of how every story, however vast or small, ends not with an ending, but a rest, a pause between breaths, a soft space where meaning can settle. And perhaps that was what the Whisperwind Library truly kept. Not the words, not even the relics, but the stillness that allows memory to remain alive. She rose and began to walk the long central aisle, her steps echoing lightly. The lamps along the walls dimmed one by one, their flames bowing to the rising sun. Dust motes turned to gold as they drifted through the air. At the great doors, she stopped and looked back once more. The light filled the library entirely, now a soft radiance that seemed to hum with life. Every shelf, every book, every relic gleamed as though awakened gently from sleep. Elara smiled, her heart steady and calm. "Rest well," she whispered. Then she turned the brass handle and opened the doors. Morning spilled in, cool and luminous. The breeze carried the scent of wild herbs and dew. She stepped into it, letting the warmth touch her face, her eyes half closed in contentment. Behind her, the great doors eased shut their sound, soft as a sigh. Inside, the Whisperwind Library settled into its next quiet dream, patient, listening, timeless. and outside the day began its own gentle remembering.